So what's behind Apple's record-breaking numbers? Great products or great tax savings, or a bit of both? From New York, I'm joined by Gillian Tett, managing editor at the Financial Times, and from Norwich by the accountant and member of the Tax Justice Network, Richard Murphy. Gillian Tett, how do they end up with numbers like this?
Well, there's certainly a bit of financial engineering involved. I mean, they have been extremely deft at managing their affairs to reduce their tax bill, and they've also been used a lot of financial engineering by issuing bonds and things like that when they didn't need it to make themselves look more profitable. But I can't run away from the fact that Apple has been absolutely extraordinarily good at producing products that people want to buy. I mean, you just heard a lot of the statistics. We've got a lot of number crunching at the FT. And on our website right now, we have figures like the fact that since 2007, they've sold 1 billion iPods, iPads and iPhones. It's quite extraordinary. They've sold enough iPads alone for every single person in Ireland and the Netherlands to have one. There's an extraordinary momentum right now in their actual computing engineering, not just their financial engineering.
And their gross profit margin is about 40% on every product, which is quite amazing in this market, isn't it?
It is quite extraordinary. And what's particularly extraordinary is the length of time they've actually managed to sustain this success. A lot of people thought that after Steve Jobs passed away, that the company would inevitably follow the pattern of most other technology giants. I mean, think of Microsoft, think of Sony, think of Xerox, all these companies which did incredibly well for a few years and then faltered. What's one thing that's remarkable about Apple is just how long it's kept going, churning out these products.
Richard Murphy, do you understand Apple's tax structure?
Nobody understands Apple's structure. It's as simple and straightforward as that. We know that Apple is not paying the tax that would be expected of it. They are quite open about that. If we look at their accounts for last year, they say that nearly $5 billion of tax was not paid because they held money in their subsidiaries outside the USA. If we look at the last quarter and extrapolate that, they probably avoided something like $2 billion of tax in the last quarter alone by simply using offshore structures. But nobody knows where the profits are earned, nobody knows where the tax is paid, and what we really need is Apple to come forward and say, we will account on a country-by-country basis so we can hold them to account where they make their profits.
Gillian Tett, why? I mean, people have criticised Google heavily and they've gone over after Amazon and Starbucks. I mean, how does Apple slightly escape the same opprobrium?
Well, I'm not sure it does escape, to be honest. I mean, I think Apple does have a lot of consumer goodwill right now because people do like their products because they're buying them. But there's a much bigger issue here, which Richard just raised, which is the question of Apple's willingness to actually engage with these issues and this criticism. Because it appears what Apple is doing is perfectly legal. It's using all the legal loopholes that currently exist in the international economy to minimize its tax bill. And that's what most companies do. It's simply a reality of modern business. But there's a bigger question here about reputation. Because if you stand back and look at what happened to the banking sector over the last decade or two, back in 2006, many banks seemed to be on top of the world. And they were also being very, very clever in running rings around the law and using all these seemingly legal but somewhat unethical tricks to boost their profits. Eventually, though, that came back to bite the banks very, very badly, and they really suffered a big damage to their reputation. And frankly, what worries me is that technology giants like Apple, which seem so successful today, could end up actually suffering a black eye because of the future reputational hit. It's really about ethics and perception right now, not necessarily about law.
Richard Murphy, what could individual governments do? I mean, there are more numbers today out of Australia and lots of anger there at the relatively small tax bill on the revenues of Australian sales, and this sort of echoes around the world every time these numbers come out. Is there anything individual governments can do to try and get at that tax?
Well, the UK has brought in its diverted profits tax, or is suggesting it will have one. I don't know how that will work, and the CBI don't know how that will work, and if we agree that we can't work out how it will work, it probably won't work. The reality is that this has to be tackled internationally. The OECD is undertaking a programme called the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Programme at the moment. I'm one of the negotiators for civil society on that programme. And what we are seeing is an enormous amount of effort being spent by companies like Apple. All the tech companies are joining together to lobby that process with considerable amounts of money, I'm sure, being spent. Now, Gillian just said that what is happening is legal, and of course it is. But we have to remember that companies like Apple and the other tech companies are spending a fortune to make sure that the law stays in their favour. Civil society is trying to put forward answers. Country-by-country reporting of their results is one that actually I created, which is now endorsed for tax by the OECD. We're making other suggestions about how to make sure that tax is paid where the profits are earned. But we are coming up against this enormous counter-attack from these firms who don't say how the system could be reformed. They just say any proposal for change won't work. Apple and the other tech companies have to face the reality, this potential reputational risk that Gillian talked about, and come to the table and say, OK, we accept we have a responsibility. We may make great products. I use Apple products. They are good. But they have done that, or built that success, on the back of the societies who funded the technology. They now have to pay their return. That return is tax. It's time they settled.
Richard Murphy, Gillian Tett, thank you both very much. John.